Hi everyone, I'm coming to you from my home as we continue our series of lectures about the use of Luke Acts for this particular nursing course. I need stuff up on the walls, I think. We moved to California about 6 months ago, and this room has been the last to get put together. It's really comfortable for doing this, but you know, the sound is a little harsher than I would like, but we're going to go for, you know, just the kind of nice context here. Having my Diet Dr. Pepper, one of my little guilty pleasures. So let's talk about the book of Luke Acts. Let's talk about the way in which we work with, by we I mean biblical scholars work with the text. I am indebted to what is almost universally called the historical critical method, and the historical critical method arises out of the Enlightenment in France and Germany, and it seeks to ask questions about history and about literature that had prior to that time been accepted on face value. So we who have been trained in this kind of methodology, and there are many methods, but this historical critical method has been the one that's dominated biblical scholarship really for the last 150 years. So there are certain questions that we ask about the text. One of the questions has to do with authorship. You know, Luke Acts is attributed historically and traditionally to Luke, the companion of St. Paul. There are several texts where it's clear that Paul and Luke are co-laborers. Philemon, verse 24, Philemon's a one-chapter book. Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, there we find that Paul refers to Luke as physician. And then also in 2 Timothy chapter 4, there's the reference to Luke among Paul's traveling companions. Now, what happens here in dealing with this this text is we ask, is it reasonable to assume that Luke is indeed, the tradition has said that Luke is the writer. Is it reasonable to suggest that he is indeed that writer? And here's where we biblical scholars kind of get down in the weeds. I'm just going to give you an example. So in Luke chapter 1, verse 2, it could be read to say that the period for which these events and this writer has is contributing is a much later period than the events as they are being recorded. So, you know, I can write a history of 5 years ago. It's reasonable to assume that I am an eyewitness, or that I have exposure to eyewitnesses, and I can find out good information about that. I can also write history about something 500 years ago. Now, I'm not going to be an eyewitness, and I can't rely on eyewitnesses. So some suggest, because there looks to be in Luke chapter 1, verse 2, a distance from the time that the events happened and the time that they're written down, a significant distance, even dating to the early part of the 2nd century, that maybe Luke isn't the writer. I am convinced actually for an earlier date for Luke, shortly after the Gospel of Mark. And we'll talk more about Mark and Luke in a subsequent lecture. Pardon me. So I don't think, when you read Luke chapter 1, verse 2, I don't think there's enough there to make me date it that far back into the 2nd century. In fact, there's some things that happen that it's interesting that Luke doesn't refer to them, or that the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts don't refer to these events if it's written in the 2nd century. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD or CE for Common Era, and the the death of Paul, which probably takes place under Nero in 65, 66 CE. Why would Luke leave those things out? It seems more likely to me that Luke is an earlier work. Some have argued, Paul talks about Luke in Colossians as being a physician. Some have argued that Luke has a particularly medical kind of perspective. It seems pretty obvious that the weight of the scholarly opinion is, it seems pretty obvious that the writer of Luke Acts has a well-developed vocabulary and is educated, but to say that it definitely betrays a medical kind of perspective, that's probably going a little further than I'd want to go. So that's why I would. It seems pretty obvious that Luke, to me, seems pretty obvious that Luke is dated a little bit earlier. There's evidence that he would be a disciple of or a companion of Paul. I don't see enough to persuade me that shouldn't be the case. So, Luke, the writer, probably sometime before Paul is martyred, in the mid-60s, which would give time for the Gospel of Mark to be written. And we'll talk, again, more about that in just a minute. So there's a little bit of why I think Luke is the writer and writes this in the early, maybe up to 65 CE. We'll be back in just a little bit to talk about genre of the Gospel.